The Treehouse of Horror series is probably one of the most fascinating series of episodes, at least in terms of production, in The Simpsons. It also happens to be a series of episodes that is somewhat constantly debated. Which one is the best overall Treehouse of Horror? That usually falls on Treehouse of Horror 5, but many would claim 3 or 4 or even 7 to be a contender. So what happens when you get a relatively good Treehouse of Horror episode and it's stuck between the most recognizable and the most well-received? You get the weird, kinda bastard child that's too well rated to be called underappreciated, but still pales in comparison to other installments. In contrast to 2, which I still think is the most underappreciated one. It's talked about enough, but it's not praised enough. 3 is the benchmark, 5 is the prime episode, so 4 is just kinda stuck in a weird spot. And I personally really like 4, but in some ways, especially compared to the year before and the year after, it does kinda come off as a bit underwhelming. What I do like about it is that the intro is straight and to the point. While the previous 3 had an opening, with 1 and 2 parodying the word of warning from Frankenstein and 3 parodying Alfred Hitchcock, this one just goes right into that opening graveyard credits, which used to kind of jump me as a kid. Like, you'd be sitting there, like, middle of the night, you know, it's April, you're waiting for your usual Simpsons episode to come on, and then just boom, thunder, and then it goes into the intro. Like, that actually jump scared me quite a few times. It's more effective than some of the other intros they used, because you just simply weren't expecting a Simpsons Halloween episode in the middle of May. I would go ahead and say it's probably the most effective use of the graveyard intro, and it has a solid couch gag. But going back to how overshadowed this episode is by its successor, 5 took this concept and did it better. Now, this is the absolute final Treehouse of Horror episode to have wraparound segments, unless they did them later, and unlike 1 and 3, where the wraparound segments could easily be considered events that took place within the continuity, and unlike 2, where it's framed more or less like an actual episode until the twist ending, this one is just a full-on parody of Rod Stewart's The Night Gallery. The first segment is the weakest one, but that's not really a bad thing. This is the warm-up segment, The Devil and Homer Simpson. It's mostly an original story. Like, I can't find anything that this was particularly based on, which I think might be a first for a Simpsons Halloween episode, as most of the stories were parodies of horror movies, Twilight Zone, and literature. It's pretty dull, but it's effective. It has the iconic image of Ned Flanders as the devil.
It's always the one you least suspect.
Which is a great twist of irony, and Homer sells his soul after Lenny and Carl eat all the donuts.
Well, there were a few left, but we chucked them at an old man for kicks.
Buzzards! I ain't dead yet!
I like the loophole Homer finds, too. That's pretty funny.
Well, hey, wait. If I don't finish this last bite, you don't get my soul, do you?
Technically no, but...
I'm smarter than the devil! I'm smarter than the devil!
You are not smarter than me!
Which all ends with a really cool looking Fantasia parody. I think the main problem with The Devil and Homer Simpson is that it's clearly not much thought was put into it. It was specifically made to be a warmer. Much like an ex-girlfriend would say to me, the length isn't the problem, it's not short. In fact, from what I can gather, Treehouse of Horror 4 is more or less given equal time to all segments, which I gotta say is pretty impressive given how they also factored in wraparound segments. There are a few good gags. The Jury of the Damned, like, I'm not up on my 70s hockey, but my dad absolutely lost it when they showed the starting line of the 1976 Philadelphia Flyers, because they were notorious for their very brutal style of playing hockey. And then, of course, there are obvious ones like Lizzie Borden, John Wilkes Booth, and Richard Nixon.
But I'm not dead yet. In fact, I just wrote an article for Redbook.
Hey, listen, I did a favor for you.
Yes, master.
Which is really funny because this episode aired, I think, in Latin American countries much later than it aired here. So when it aired here, Richard Nixon was actually still alive. I think he actually died maybe 3 months after it came out, but they had to do a different line in overseas dubs, where instead of saying, "But I'm not dead yet," he just says, "Why am I doomed?" I mentioned this in my Phil Hartman video, but this is the only Treehouse of Horror to feature Lionel Hutz, and he absolutely kills it.
Mr. Simpson, don't you worry. I watched Matlock in a bar last night. The sound wasn't on, but I think I got the gist of it.
But all in all, this whole segment's kind of flat. It starts and then it just kind of wraps itself up with the revelation that Homer pledged to Marge his soul, and therefore the devil has no claim to it. But at least the donut transformation's kind of brutal. Out of 10, I'd have to give this a 5. It's the textbook definition of average. It's funny, but it's not like a killer installment.
Webster's defines it as an agreement under the law which is unbreakable. Which is unbreakable. Excuse me, I must use the restroom.
Mr. Hutz?
Up next is the one that made my top 10 a few years ago, and it's one that traumatized a whole generation of children.
I'll leave Hobart!
Terror at 5.5 Feet is a parody of the classic Twilight Zone episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. And this segment was actually my first exposure to the whole story. I remember my dad telling me, yeah, it's based on an old Twilight Zone episode, and he showed me the Shatner one. Which I feel I should note is also funny because this is the second Treehouse of Horror segment to adapt a Twilight Zone episode that was also in the movie. I think that one's like probably one of the most popular Twilight Zone episodes of all time. It's definitely in the top 3, like most people at least are aware of it. Now this parody does channel the 80s movie version more in how it's shot, like they actually do a shot-for-shot moment of the Lithgow version, but in spirit it's like the Shatner version, I guess. I've mentioned this many times, but I think one of the most effective types of horror is putting a person in a situation where everyone is in danger but nobody believes them and thinks that the person who knows is crazy. And that's what makes this work. Like Bart sees a gremlin on the side of the school bus and nobody believes him. He gets tied down by Skinner, who is written as a bus passenger.
Hello, Simpson. I'm riding the bus today because Mother hid my car keys to punish me for talking to a woman on the phone. She was right to do it.
And then Willie gets on here, so we have like authority, because otherwise there wouldn't really be any authority if they didn't do this. Like, who's gonna restrain Bart? I don't think Otto's gonna do it. Having Skinner on there to kind of doubt Bart really helps this along. On top of all the horror though, I think this one is the powerhouse of funny moments for this whole entire Treehouse of Horror episode. You got the first appearance of Uter, who is depicted as a crude German stereotype. There's a lot of little funny things in here, like Homer stealing all the boating equipment.
Marge, look at all this great stuff I found at the marina. It was just sitting in some guy's boat.
The earlier dream fake out with the Krusty trading cards.
Krusty visits relatives in Annapolis, Maryland. Krusty poses for trading card photo.
I remember my dad explaining that this whole thing was a parody of like the Star Wars trading cards and how it had like that rock hard sharp gum.
Well, at least you got the gum. Ow! I cut my cheek!
And my dad said, yeah, that's exactly what happened. I cut my cheek. And honestly, the Krusty trading cards themselves is somehow one of the funniest things in the entire episode and in the entire series for me. I never realized how funny the whole thing, Krusty visits relatives in Annapolis, Maryland. Like, why is that funny? I think it has something to do with the fact that Annapolis is a place I was aware of because my dad's family lives in Maryland, and it's a funny location because it is technically the capital of Maryland, but most people would assume Baltimore was the capital. America's really weird like that. The visual gags are on point here, there's no doubt about it, but as a parody, it gets all the beats from the source material right, and it does manage to throw its own little twists in the story to kind of freshen it up. Bart definitely acts more like Lithgow than Shatner, which goes with the fact that this parody is more modeled on the movie version than the TV version, but it's still great nonetheless. But the real kicker here that makes it so memorable is the conclusion, where after Bart saves the day but is committed to a nut house, the gremlin returns after having a run-in with Ned Flanders, killing him off screen and giving us this gem of a nightmare-inducing moment. I honestly don't know how much more I can say this, but ask anybody who was a kid in the 90s when this was airing in reruns, and they will say that this fucking traumatized them. But it's one of those weird traumas, like you're not running out of the room screaming, you're just kind of watching and like you're in shock. It's there so quickly and you don't really have much time to register that it's messed up, but it like sticks with you. And this isn't me talking, my friend Adam commented on my top 10 and he's like, I'm glad I'm not the only one who's traumatized by the gremlin holding Flanders' decapitated head. I even asked Robin about it, and she was like, yeah, that shit freaked me out too. Which is pretty funny considering Treehouse of Horror 5 is technically the more scary one. It's definitely the more graphic one, but like when I think of like Treehouse of Horror moments that actually affected me in a way of like horror, this is what comes up. It's bloodless, but it's still disturbing, especially when you're like a 7 or 8 year old kid. The way they drew it, like the spine hanging out with the nerves and like Ned's face, it's pretty graphic, but it's also not that graphic at the same time. And having him talk actually makes it creepier than if he was just like a dead head. Which, you know, somebody who wants to comment on this, feel free to, because I did not watch this with commentary, but I get the feeling this was like one of those studio notes where I would assume that initially it was written to just be Flanders' head and it didn't talk, but then they were like, oh, you can't do that. You gotta make it talk so it's like, you know, it's funny. But yeah, it didn't work like that. It wasn't funny. It was fucking disturbing. I love this segment so much, and you know what? I am fully comfortable dropping a 10 out of 10 on it, which I believe is a first for my individual Treehouse of Horror reviews. It's quick and to the point, and it packs in the jokes and the horror, and in this case, does a fine job representing what it's a parody of.
Your behavior was still disruptive, young man. Perhaps spending the remainder of your life in a madhouse will teach you some manners.
The final segment is Bart Simpson's Dracula, which is faked out to be a story based on the dogs playing poker painting.
They're dogs, and they're playing poker!
And I'm honestly shocked in their complete desperation to try and bring back old fans of The Simpsons that in a modern Treehouse of Horror they haven't actually tried to just do a story based on this painting. Much like Terror at 5.5 feet, Bart Simpson's Dracula is a parody of both versions, but it plays off the recent Francis Ford Coppola Dracula adaptation from 1992 much more. Like, look at the design of Burns' Dracula and Smithers' Renfield, as well as the overall look. It's a pretty straightforward parody where Mr. Burns is Dracula. It's pretty funny from the get-go. The cops thinking it's a mummy and destroying a bunch of ancient Egyptian artifacts is hilarious, as well as them destroying the Mona Lisa, and it sets itself up pretty good, even if the Pennsylvania joke is a little bit of a low-hanging fruit. This is another story centered around the cast not believing the central character, who in this case is Lisa.
The creature they seek is the walking undead. Nosferatu, das Vampir. A vampire.
Lisa, vampires are make-believe, just like elves, gremlins, and Eskimos.
And it's kind of funny how Treehouse episodes usually do Lisa, Bart, and Homer as the focus of all these stories. Up to this point, I think Marge, while having the distinction of being the first central character of a Treehouse of Horror segment, only really had one more appearance as the center, and that was still shared with Homer in King Homer. Nevertheless, this is a really funny episode, and it has some banger lines.
Do you notice anything strange?
Yeah, his hairdo looks so queer.
I heard that.
It was a boy!
It does a pretty good job at poking fun of the movie in which it's parodying, but it kind of just runs off in all sorts of directions. So what starts as kind of a Dracula parody ends with Burns biting Bart and turning him into a vampire, and then it starts to kind of parody more contemporary vampire movies, namely The Lost Boys, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is fine, but they could have just as easily done Fright Night and it probably would have been a bit cleaner. Like, this is still good, it's just a bit unfocused. And any 90s kids or 2000s kids who grew up in Canada, you obviously remember this gem of a line from the promos for the Treehouse of Horror episodes on Teletoon.
Take that, vile fiend!
Dad, that's his crotch.
Oh, sorry.
The way they wrap this up is pretty abrupt. Like, they kill Burns thinking he's the head vampire, but then it turns out Marge is the head vampire, and it all just kind of turns into a Charlie Brown Christmas parody. All in all, while this segment does have a few groaner jokes, it is pretty solid, and I'd have to give it a 7 out of 10, above average, because it's full of memorable events and just looks so nice in its art style.
And there's something fishy about this whole setup.
Lisa, stop being so suspicious. Did everyone wash their necks like Mr. Burns' ass?
Yes.
Sure did.
So we got a 5 out of 10, a 10 out of 10, and a 7 out of 10. What's this going to equal up to? Honestly, I don't even really have a system for using individual scores to calculate the overall score, so I just kind of wing it. So with that being said, Treehouse of Horror 4 as a whole, factoring in the overall presentation with the intro and the wraparounds and the stories, I could easily give this an 8.5 out of 10. It's a high caliber installment, and I dare say that pound for pound, I do kind of like it over Treehouse of Horror 3, but it's not quite Treehouse of Horror 5. It's fun, it's one I actually don't see all that often lately, but saw it a lot as a kid, but I still love it. What are your thoughts on Treehouse of Horror 4? What's your favorite story? Let me know in the comments. And also, let me know how Ned's severed head traumatized you as a kid. Everybody loves talking about trauma on the internet lately, so this should be an easy subject for you guys to tackle.
And honestly, I apologize for cutting Halloween short this year. I usually get my burnout around November. It came early this year, and I just could not get myself to do those other 2 videos, but worry not, I'm gonna be completely overhauling how I do my videos from now on in order to kind of not only prevent burnout from happening so often and so hard, but to also make my videos better for you. That being said, I said I was going to take a total break until February. I'm kind of coming out of it. I'm not going to do anything huge for a while, but I do have a few videos in mind to cap out the year. There's going to be definitely some more Simpsons in me because those videos are easy as shit for me to do, and I actually really enjoy doing them. But it won't just be all Simpsons. I'm going to be doing a few 10 to 15 minute videos over the next few months until the end of the year, and then I'm going to, start working on some bigger projects for 2024. So in the spirit of The Simpsons, I'm wishing you a happy Halloween at the end of the first week of November. Bye.
Happy Halloween, everybody!